Hello and welcome to Smith and Sheridan on Biotech, a podcast on the science and business of biotechnology, presented by me, Cormac Sheridan.
And me, Andy Smith. Hello, everyone. Hello, Cormac. How are you?
I'm doing good, Andy. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks.
Today we're going to talk about money, the essential ingredient that allows biotechnology, among other things, to function. There's always a need for it. There's always a supply, but that supply varies considerably. And quite a lot of people spend all their time looking at the supply rather than the outcomes that are generated by the supply. But the supply in itself is the preoccupation of quite a lot of investment professionals. And I think it's an area that you probably have a bit more interest in than I have, to be frank.
I don't know if whether we can call it interest, Cormac. As someone who's no longer an institutional investor, I am bemused, at least, about
Mm.
what happens and where we are in the market and the money supply and who buys these things sometimes
Mm.
and who sells these things at
Well,
others.
I'm almost struck by these really smart people who come on those market-orientated TV shows. You can get clips of them on
Mm.
media and all the rest of it. And they just seem to have a perfect understanding of what's happening at this moment and why things are up, why things are down, who raised how much and why. And I mean, you can cobble together a narrative, if you like, about any set of events. Whether or not it bears any relationship to reality is very, very difficult to actually validate, isn't it?
Yeah, and people look at biotech stock market indices, that's public biotech companies,
Yes.
as a guide to where we are in the market, where they're moving, whether they're going up, whether they're down, whether the 50-day average has crossed the 200-day average, and what does that mean?
And
And
actually, what does that mean technically? I don't even know what that actually tells us.
on one way, if the 50-day moving average crosses the moving day average in the upward direction, known as the golden cross, which means we're off to the races. The whole sector's going up. If it goes the other way, it's the death cross, which means the sector's moving down. And it's only maths. It's got nothing to
Mhm.
do with fundamentals. It's worse than maths. It's averages built on all the investors who could buy or sell stocks doing so in a particular way. And it doesn't actually mean anything. I'm with you in terms of we need to think about the fundamentals of the sector rather than where the stock market happens. But what happens to the stock market and what happens to fundraising? But that does happen, but largely in retrospect. And academic forecasters have tried for years for looking at moving stock price data and index price data to try and predict when you're just going to get to that bit where it accelerates up and you're just going to get a bit where we've gone too far and it goes down again.
I
And
love the idea, though, that, say, that could be influenced by a bench scientist making some catastrophic error in an experiment that results in a company's share price tanking. All these indices fall, and it's all because just some poor guy or gal wasn't concentrating on what they were doing, and they just put the wrong thing into the wrong thing, and the experiment was a disaster.
well, in that case, we would never know, right? It's probably not material and it would never impact it. But it works the other way, though. Don't you remember in 2000 when was it Tony Blair and Bill Clinton were on the White House lawn proclaiming the sequencing of the human genome for the first time? And then the Nasdaq Biotech Index moved up to 2000, 2001 highs before it fell down again. So we knew that. We knew that it would enable molecular medicines and proteins and even possibly we'd hope gene editing and gene therapy at that point.
At that point, we didn't know anything about gene editing, really, did we?
Well, no, no,
I know I stand corrected. I think the pre-CRISPR technology, zinc finger nucleases, were they?
all right, yeah, yeah.
I can't remember the exact timelines.
Well, like us, they're still bumbling along, right? So it's a tenuous link between
Yeah.
where we are and what we termed our first podcast ever was on the
Mm.
wilderness period, right?
Yeah.
Where the majority of investors outside of those who have to invest in biotech are not interested in biotech at all. And we're taking a number of drivers in terms of fundraising, therapeutic advances, and CRISPR is one of those that is actually happening with approved products now,
Hmm.
and deal flow. And again, that seems to be moving in the right direction. Certainly the last 2 weeks of the year, and then since the start of the year, yes, we've seen
Hmm.
companies buy other companies, largely restricted to areas of our previous podcasts. In fact, radiopharmaceuticals, drug
Yeah.
antibody conjugates, guinea jabs, that sort of thing. So, there's certain areas that are in or hot if we're talking about radiopharmaceuticals, and that they are on the deal making menu for big pharma today. And they need to do it, right? They need to do it because of their patent expiry. So,
Although, let us as well acknowledge the area of antipsychotic medicines,
mm,
because BMS just closed their whopping big acquisition of Karuna within the last week. $14 billion deal, or 12.7 billion net of what Karuna had on its balance sheet, just for primarily an antipsychotic drug, which has a supposedly differentiated mechanism. It's a selective activator of muscarinic acetylcholine receptors in the brain. And that's a huge amount of money to shell out. But obviously, we know that schizophrenia or psychotic related illnesses are not adequately served. And I haven't seen any data for this myself yet. I just didn't go looking for it, but it has a September 2024 PDUFA date.
mm.
So it could be an approved drug by then. And obviously, BMS, which you wouldn't traditionally associate with neuropsychiatric disease, they've made a big bet here. That's very, very.
It's interesting on a number of levels, isn't it? Because I mean, who would you amongst big pharma associate with neuropsychiatric therapeutic area these days?
Mm,
Go back a few years and everyone was ditching them like they were, I'm trying to think of
yeah.
the right analogy, but a hot potato, if you like,
Yes.
just because the failure rate was so high. And, yes, you point out that the unmet need is still very high, perhaps
Mhm.
more so nowadays than it ever was
Yeah.
before, certainly amongst younger patients.
Yeah.
And the molecules to treat them either don't work as you want them to, or they have side effects. So there still is a large unmet need.
Yeah.
But
The
yeah,
whole
to
area,
get
though, became much more popular again. It swung back into fashion in recent years because of the success of the psychedelic drugs and the kind of forerunner of it, even though I don't think it's a psychedelic drug per se, strictly speaking. But J&J got the approval for
ketamine, yeah,
ketamine, yeah, the old horse tranquilizer,
yeah.
which the first time I ever came across it, actually, I encountered a gentleman in a pub who confessed to being on it and he admitted to being in some sort of a very comatose state. I'd never even heard of
Mm,
it in my life, either in equine
yeah,
or
human, yeah.
in recreational drug settings. But the psychedelics have really brought that area. And I know quite a few companies were raising serious cash a few years ago. So that's an area as well. And combined with some progress in neuroscience, basic research in general, there has been a bit of a renaissance in funding companies, generally speaking, in either neurodegenerative disease or obviously the neuropsychiatric disease. So that's an area
But it is
too.
it is an important thing to note that, and in fact, I'm reminded of the Lion King in much of what I'm about to say now. In that, you know,
Okay, I'm waiting with pricked ears.
biotech is like the Lion King in that there is a circle of life, right? We have
Oh my God.
we but there are many circles, and I don't know whether many other industries have it, but we have the IPO window, right, that
Mhm,
opens and
mhm,
closes, in
mhm.
which biotech companies can IPO and then they can't again.
Yeah,
And I'm sure mining and resources sectors don't have that, but or even tech doesn't have that. But we have it in biotech because it opens, we have a bubble period. It gets so bad that the very earliest stage, the highest risk companies, like in the past, neuropsychiatric medicine companies would have come to the market. And I can remember, as probably can you, Cormac, that companies or nicotinic acid receptors, they were the big things years ago, and they virtually came to nothing in neuropsychiatric medicine. But
yeah,
so we have these cycles,
we do.
funding cycles, favored therapeutic areas, and you're absolutely right. It's about time neuropsychiatric medicine got its turn, right?
Mm,
Because it was
mm,
left
mm.
behind and still is left behind by oncology and then
Yeah,
metabolic and even vaccines. But we have these cycles that have funding windows that open and close because the very earliest stage at the end of that IPO window, very earliest stage companies, the highest risk companies come to the market, they disappoint. And the generalist investor who doesn't have to be in biotech all the time thinks, never again. and they sell their biotech holdings and they go invest in something that's much more stable and they can understand more.
Yeah.
And that's why we have a cycle. That's why we came off in 2021, August 21, the peak of the last cycle, and we've been bumping around ever
Mm.
since in the wilderness period.
Yeah, and I think in the last batch of IPOs that got away in February or so, there hasn't been much activity out in March, but in February, I mean, there's only one neuroscience company that got out. That was Alto Neuroscience, which did raise a healthy $129 million or so. And they're into
Yep.
things like, oh, a bunch of things actually, cognition, emotion, sleep and its activity, so it's kind of mental health disorders is the kind of broken or the general sort of broad area that they're involved in. And of course, it's biomarker driven, AI enabled drug
Oh, of
discovery.
course it is. Yes.
Yeah.
There have been two others since on the CG oncology and
Yeah. Yeah.
mega beta genome.
Yeah. CG raised quite a lot of cash, but that for a phase 3 drug, they raised $380 million back in January for prestostimogene, which is basically it's a bladder cancer drug to spare the bladder. Because if you undergo bladder removal for bladder cancer, you have a pretty awful sort of quality of life
Yeah.
afterwards. That was another healthy one, yeah. Another biggie was Kyverna Therapeutics, cell therapy for autoimmune disease, $319 million. And some of them are doing better than others. I mean, Alto is just a little bit off its IPO price. CG Oncology has more than doubled. The IPO price was $19 a share. Now they're up to 41 and change. Kyverna is a little bit ahead from its IPO price, $22 per share, then 26.90 or so at yesterday's close. So some of the IPOs are in positive territory, some are in negative, some of them are really small anyway. I mean, it always surprises me to see people raising $6 and $7 million on a Nasdaq IPO. To me, that's a kind of it's a sub VC type of total, and to me, it means you're not really a serious company. That you're kind of really third or fourth tier if you can't raise.
But that's an interesting point, though, that the more money you can raise, what does it say? Does it say that your investment proposition is much better than those who couldn't raise more? Or does it mean that the number of investors who could invest in any biotechnology company are fewer than they would have been at other times? Or does it just mean that your bankers are better and can twist more arms than the other one?
It's probably all of the above.
All of the above. Yep, absolutely. All of the above.
But at the same time, I think if the only place you can raise $6 or $7 million is on Nasdaq, I think you've got problems.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it reminds me a more egregious example is the First North exchange in Sweden, where companies might raise 1 million or they might raise 500,000. And they don all the clothing of a listed company and they have these updates to the market and they behave as if they're sort of Pfizer. And to me, it's just nonsense. I've said it in the past to somebody who represents companies in that region. I was saying, these guys, they're just playing a house. This isn't serious. And so we all know what a good company looks like. We can smell them. It doesn't mean that they're going to be successful, but we all know the sort of path that good companies go down. And, they'll raise whatever, 50, and it used to be 50, 25 or 50 was a very respectable Series A round. Now, especially if you're a US company, it needs to be 100 million at least. And
It's got to be, yeah.
And it might be more. But that's kind of what's needed to sort of be taken seriously and get on people's radar screens. I mean, obviously 50 is fine too. And obviously the science needs to be interesting. But the good companies, they know how it's done. They know the playbook, and it is a playbook. And I guess there is this game as well between the investment market and the companies that are seeking their money and their attention. And that game plays out, and each knows their roles in that. And it works. When it works quite well, except it does result in hugely expensive medicines and huge rewards for people who probably don't necessarily deserve all that, even though they might deserve some of it. That's another day's argument.
And what the generalist investor who needs to support an open IPO window and the volume of companies that when they come that need to come, they don't understand the risks associated with biotech. They don't understand that, a preclinical or even still in phase 1 company has a 90% chance of failure. They just want to invest it because the rest of biotech has gone up a lot. The share prices are, and this is the cheapest thing they can get in offer. And It's also a function of how desperate the bankers make them feel that the fear of missing out is.
Mm.
And I remember going back to the IPO, I think a window that opened in 2004 or 2005, and the first two out in the various markets on NASDAQ, it was a company called Accusphere. And in London main list, which was a big thing at the time, first biotech to list on the main market on the London Stock Exchange since the IPO window closed was Arc Therapeutics. Both have disappeared back to obscurity and the hands of the liquidator
Mhm.
within a reasonably short period of time. I don't think the analysts who cover them or many of the investors appreciated the risks of when we're in a bubble period, and we're absolutely not in a bubble period. When we are in a bubble period, all rules or normal time rules don't apply. And things that are down to their last 50 pence or 50 cents, will IPO because they need the money, only because they need the money, not because they have a compelling investment proposition. And things that will just to start to jump on the bandwagon. So almost at the top of the next biotech bubble, you can see there are radiopharmaceutical companies that might have started 5 minutes ago IPOing
Mhm.
after one round. So there are sort of behaviors that you don't want. But
Mhm.
then if you don't, and I can't get my head around this, we want the good ones, right? But we can't have the good ones, as you were saying, the gene editing companies of the future, can't have the good ones without all the bad ones as well.
Is there an argument to be made that biotech as a whole is less risky now than it was 2 decades ago because we have more sophisticated understanding of both disease and of cellular and organ physiology. And because, say, in certain areas, when you're dealing with monogenic disease, especially, and gene therapy, you fully understand the issue that you're trying to deal with. And hopefully, not guaranteed, but hopefully, you have the tools and technologies at your disposal that'll enable you to achieve a meaningful clinical benefit.
Yeah, that is an argument. And
Mhm.
we can do things today that could never have been done in medicine. I mean, look at CAR Ts. We talked about those before. Look at the skinny jabs, even that effects last long enough to be, and look at gene therapy and gene editing. We've never been able to do that. And that's one argument. The other argument is that we are so far along in modern medicine that all the easy drugs, and we talked about this before, all the easy drugs have been discovered and then
Mhm.
they're now generic. So to do the next level drugs, that the next high unmet need, they're more difficult conditions to treat and require more risky
Mhm.
medicines with more side effects,
Mhm.
perhaps marginal, less than marginal effects.
I agree with you that we are, to me, we're in this intermediate phase that, yeah, the low-hanging fruit is long gone, but we have developed genetic technologies and gene editing technologies and delivery technologies to an extent, but there are still massive bottlenecks in terms of delivery, in terms of the ability to redose. I'm talking about virus-mediated delivery these of therapeutic payloads. And
And to justify the pricing for
yeah,
those
yeah,
for
yeah.
those particular. I mean, I wrote a script article a few weeks ago about why these new advanced therapies have been so unsuccessful, and I did put something in there which I then took out afterwards, and it
Mhm.
went something along the lines of, whoever it was who thought up you can charge $2 to $3 million for a dose of a medicine and
Mhm.
get away with it probably needs a different career move, because it has not resulted in the success. I mean, some patients, yes, have been treated.
Yeah.
Some patients have been cured. Yeah. But the wider application, more patients are not being treated just because someone and it's not that much more expensive to run that clinical trial. It's more
Mhm.
expensive, yes, than a standard small
Mhm.
molecule antidepressant, but it's not so much more expensive that you have to charge two, three, $4 million per one-off dose to a patient. And yes, yeah, I get the pharmacoeconomic arguments that you're saving a lifetime's therapy of a very expensive therapy or something that can't be treated at all, and
Mhm.
carers times. Yes, but as someone who's worked in pricing and market access,
Mhm.
since when has that been a basis? We try, but the arguments don't always
Mhm.
work.
But you see, I think, and that is my point in a way, that we're still sort of at, well, it seems wrong to use the word primitive, but These are still nascent
Mm,
technologies
mm,
that certainly have achieved outcomes, but they're not. I'd love to, if somebody had the data, to see how many people across the world have received any form of gene therapy in a commercial setting across all conditions.
mm,
It's probably no more than a few thousand at the very most. But I was interested in just looking back at some of the transactions, the financial transactions, the investment deals that have been done recently. And one that caught my eye was a company I did speak to when they raised their Series A round, Capstan Therapeutics. And they just closed a 175 million Series B round. And there's some very, very interesting people involved there. You know, the scientific founders are Drew Weissman, Carl June, and Bruce Levine, you know, so that's this
hmm
lot
hmm
of RT therapy and
Yeah.
mRNA-based therapies and vaccines. And they have a very, very clever idea. They're trying to do these in vivo CAR T cells.
Oh, yes, I remember. Yes.
Yeah. These targeted nanoparticles that deliver an RNA payload to cells of interest.
Yep.
Their lead program they've divulged is CD8 T cells. And they're basically trying to do a kind of an on the fly reprogramming of these so that they express a CD19 chimeric antigen receptor and that they can hit B cells, and whether that's for B cell malignancies or B cell driven autoimmune disease, which could be very, very interesting. So they're still preclinical. They'll be going to the clinic soon, I think. And the idea of in vivo gene therapy, in vivo gene editing, any of the above is fascinating to me because we can see the massive success of the COVID-19 vaccines. It's a
Mm.
different matter, obviously, to get something that's going to generate something in the nucleus, maybe, if that's where you need to go. But it doesn't always have to be the nucleus either. I assume if you're just trying to get a CD19 CAR, that's just a cytoplasmic delivery problem that you're dealing with there. And that's going to be very, very interesting. And it's complicated stuff. And I think as well, they're interested in these transient effects. So they're not necessarily looking
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
a kind of a one and done type approach.
Mm.
It might be more like sort of a vaccine effort, you know? And I'm fascinated by that. I'm very interested in that whole possibility about in vivo cell programming and also just taking the CAR Ts and putting them onto other cellular chassis, be
Mm.
it natural killer cell, there's even talk of B cells. There's huge innovation still to come, and I think we're only at the start of it in a sense. And you would obviously be concerned to see that that type of innovation is it's much higher risk
Mm.
than some of the other stuff, but the rewards are very considerable. And these are difficult investment decisions to make. I mean, when you're signing, you know, I know these are syndicated rounds. It's not as if one person's on the hook for 175 million bucks, but you know, I didn't look at the number of investors, but everybody's on the hook, I'm sure, for 20, 30, 40 million dollars there, and the lead
Yeah.
investor probably for quite a large chunk of it.
Mm.
It's a lot of cash.
Yeah. And if I can just add a word of caution to your scientific enthusiasm, I've seen many companies over the years where you come out of a meeting and you think, that is so interesting.
Yeah.
That science is so eloquent. You almost convince yourself, I don't know if it's cognitive dissonance or not. It has to work because it looks so good.
Mhm.
And most of them don't. The only one really, do you remember the antibody that Roche developed for haemophilia? Not a factor 9 or 10 replacement, but an antibody that treats
Mm.
haemophilia, that brings two molecules
Yeah.
together.
Hemlibra, I think,
That's
is
it, Hemlibra. And I
yeah.
thought that was so scientifically eloquent. It's got to work. And it's virtually the only transformational thing that has been as successful as Hemlibra has been.
Yeah.
Everything else is either missed or
Mhm.
still in progress. And you see companies produce an announcement of phase 1 or phase 2 data that says we have this very interesting data, and that interesting word is a euphemism for saying we didn't actually demonstrate a clinical benefit, but
Yeah.
we think something's going in the right direction.
Yeah, I agree. No, Hemlibra, and it has been a very successful drug for them commercially,
Yeah,
but it's been
yeah.
extremely successful clinically as well, without a doubt.
But when I saw that technology, I thought, oh,
Mm.
this is so good. I
Yeah.
almost wasn't interested because it looked so scientifically good.
Well, I felt the same way when I looked at what Vertex was doing in cystic fibrosis with their molecular chaperones, because
Yeah.
the data were just so good. And I was very interested as well then to see a company that I confess was new to me, and that it ought not to have been because they've just raised the Series C round. Sionna Therapeutics, they raised $182 million, and they've delved further into the structural biology of the cystic fibrosis transmembrane conductance regulator, which is
Hmm.
this ion channel that is mutated, or at least the gene is mutated in cystic fibrosis patients. So they look at different domains of that protein, and they are developing these small molecules that stabilize those specific domains. And there's three domains that they're actually drugging separately. One's called the first nucleotide binding domain. Another's called the CFT, or intracellular loop 4, and another one called the transmembrane domain 1. And they're in phase 1 with one of their molecules, and a whole bunch of them are lined up to follow. And to me, that's going to be very interesting to see whether or not they can build upon and improve the standard of care that's now emerged in terms of the slew of drugs developed by Vertex and others. I like that kind of stuff. I love the idea of a small molecule having such a profound effect on a partially mutated protein that you can restore or maintain function that would otherwise be lost. I just think that's
Mm.
awesome, actually. Um,
Yeah.
Big fan there. So I'll be very interested to see what they can achieve there. And I do think that small molecule chemistry, and I never liked chemistry in university. It was never my thing. And I was never, ever going to be very interested in that route at all. So when I have to learn about things like click chemistry or
Mm.
swapping out electron donors and stuff, oh, my eyes glaze over. But I have profound respect for the achievements of people working in small molecule chemistry. You might think that that's an area that would get kind of washed away in the
Yeah.
stampede, or the flood rather, of interest around genetic and cellular approaches. No, they've really delivered. And because they're scalable, and there's no delivery problems. You just take them by mouth or by IV
Hmm.
injection
Hmm.
or sub-Q injection, and away you go. And there is that possibility of genericization once the patents have expired, which
Yeah.
means they'll be available cheaply, and you don't have to have top-tier private health insurance to afford these things.
Hmm.
So innovation there is always welcome, and I think, say, that's one example of small molecule innovation. Another one that kind of caught my eye is Fog Pharma. They've raised $145 million in a Series E round to develop peptide modulators of protein-protein and protein-DNA interactions, which is very ambitious stuff. And their lead compound is in a phase 1/2 trial in solid tumors. Complex mechanisms, you obviously would layer them on top of existing therapies.
Mm.
I love the way they call themselves Fog Pharma, because data and fog
Mm.
go very well together. So there's almost an implicit acknowledgement that, well, maybe they're trying to find a way through the fog. Maybe
Well,
that's,
yeah, it's one of two areas, protein-protein interaction and then PROTACs, protein degraders,
yeah.
things that have been on the
We need to take a look
cards.
at protein degraders in a future episode, and have they delivered, or where are they?
Well, yeah, perhaps let's not give away. I mean, things that have been on the cards and Cormac has been enthusiastic about for a number of years and still haven't yet delivered. But are we on the cusp? There you go. There's a theme.
Yes, exactly. So we're sort of, as you say, I think we're bumping along, and bumping along is fine. And
Yeah.
obviously, when there's funding desert, it is bad because good people get lost in the industry and talent
Hmm.
goes elsewhere, or else scientists are not doing what they can do. When there's too much cash, it just becomes. I remember years ago, an analyst here in Dublin, speaking of the high days of the Neumarkt, we're going back to the
Yeah.
1990s.
Yeah.
He used to make the point that in a big wind, even turkeys can fly.
Uh-huh.
um,
Until it stops blowing and then the
yeah.
Neumarkt what goes away. Yeah.
But obviously, though, what's happened in the last 20 years, the industry has been transformed in terms of the amount of cash that's coming into it. And even now, if we're not sort of in the midst of a feeding frenzy, I mean, there were some big transactions. Kyverna and CG Oncology, we've mentioned, they both raised over 300 million in IPOs. In terms of secondary offerings, there was one particular big one. Apogee Therapeutics raised 483 million. That includes the overlapping option
Hmm.
for their, essentially for extended dose biologics for inflammatory and immune conditions. So this is kind of a
Mm.
de-risked area, and it's not highly innovative. They just want to be supplanting sort of the incumbents. But this comes back to points you've raised previously. Will payers pay a premium for an extended dose antibody that you have to only deliver every 2 or 3 months versus a biosimilar that's a fraction of the price?
Well, typically in the US, they don't, right? That's
Yeah,
the
yeah,
patient's
yeah,
problem or
yeah,
the carer's problem rather
yeah.
than the insurance company's problem.
Yes, but there is a big chunk of cash, and the three-digit million VC rounds are back, as Fierce Biotech have been saying, or endpoints rather, as they're due. So it is happening, but at the same time, I think we do need to acknowledge the fact that the Nasdaq Biotech Index is down 1% since the start of the year. It's up 12% over the last 12 months. It's up 30% only over the last 5 years. If you compare that with the Nasdaq Index itself, it's up 11% year to date, 40.6% over the last 12 months and 115% over the last 5 years.
Well,
So,
that's largely been driven by tech
yeah, it is.
and AI. So anything that's got AI in it is
Yeah.
responsible for a large amount of that.
Yeah, I would say though, if you take any 5 year segment and compare the performance of biotech versus tech, apart from the pandemic year, I would imagine that tech generally outperforms it because they make money. The biotech guys generate premia on the basis of an M&A transaction. Typically, very few of them make money.
And on the way to that transaction, they make losses
Yeah,
and need to raise money. Yeah.
that's correct. And it's also interesting to me that Biotech reported their 2023 results recently, and um, they made big profits, although not as much as they used to, and they exited 2023 with $17.7 billion or so, euros rather, on the balance sheet. Their market cap around now is 21.8, 21.9 billion euros.
Mhm.
So the market is only giving an intrinsic value of about 3 billion euros or so to their pipeline and to their profitable vaccine product.
Yeah. And they're going back to their roots, right? So they always were an oncology company. And as you hinted at before, oncology with a diagnostic that went alongside of
Mm,
it.
mm.
But they're also coming off having saved the world from the pandemic. And investors are fickle, right? Thanks a lot for doing that. Now, what's next is what
Yeah.
they're saying. And yeah, until what's next appears, it's unproven.
Eaten bread is soon forgotten.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. So we're not at the bottom. We're not at
we're
the
not
top.
at the top, but we're
Yeah.
bumbling on in between. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There's something to be said for a Goldilocks period in biotech. It's uncomfortable at the bottom, it's
Yeah.
uncomfortable at the top, but let's see what the technology brings us.
Yeah. Let us see that. And it will soon because events will always occur. Until the next time, Andy.
Cheers, Comax. Cheers, everyone. Bye bye.
Bye.